Up? Okay. All right. Yeah, there's some sheets going around back there. Good morning, everybody. It's really a great delight. It's a great delight to see such a big crowd here. Judging by the attendance and looking out, so I know some people are leaving for Florida, but some people will be here for the entire winter, so that gives me some encouragement to perhaps do some more of these lectures over the coming months. The truth is, that's a perfect segue to the apology that I want to start with. This is not some fake humility that sometimes rabbis begin their lectures with. This is as sincere as it gets, that I made a mistake in so much as this is simply too much to cover in a two-part lecture series. I mean, the importance of the material that we're going to just scrape the surface and discuss today, it's too important to do in just 45 minutes. And as such, I really just make an apology that I think we just, I take the responsibility, and I drag Rabbi Reiner down with me, but I take the responsibility of really just biting off more than we can chew in 45 minutes. So I just beg your indulgence as we just do really a survey of a couple of critical pieces of philosophy that relates to religious Zionism today. And I give you my word, with God's help, that we'll have more opportunities to study all of these pieces much more in depth over the coming weeks and months, Bezrat Hashem. So last time we met 2 weeks ago, Rabbi Reiner discussed the perspectives of a number of influential thinkers regarding Zionism, and did a beautiful job of outlining why, specifically in the 19th century, we really see the rise of the concept of Zionism to begin with. And I'm going to discuss today specifically religious Zionism, which pits together the concept of Jewish people, Jewish identity, nationalism, but with a Torah perspective. Just by way of introduction, one more thing. I know Bernie made an announcement today that went down on the phone tree that Rabbi Reiner would be speaking. So when I walked up today and I saw such a large crowd, I understood why everybody's here. But I think it's a bait and switch, and I apologize for that. But Bernie, you did good. I'll pay you later. So one of the people that Rabbi Reiner discussed last week was Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who was born in Prussia in 1795 and died also in Prussia in 1874. And he's credited as being one of the really forerunners of modern Zionism, but religious modern Zionism. Kalischer first expressed his Zionist ideas in a letter he wrote in 1836 to the head of the Berlin branch of the Rothschild family. He explained that the beginning of Messianic redemption will be brought about by human effort and by the will of the governments to gather the scattered of Israel into the Holy Land. His letter did not do very much to propel anything forward, but in 1860 there was some more movement that gathered, and ultimately this culminated in 1862 with his very important work called Drishat Zion, Seeking Zion. And I want to share with you just the opening 2 or 3 paragraphs from Drishat Zion, from the Pticha, from his words of introduction, because it captures such an important kernel of what religious Zionism stands for, and it really stands as a stark contrast to other beliefs about Zionism that are ones that we don't espouse, but it doesn't mean we can't study them. Okay, so what you're looking at and I apologize I didn't put in the numbers for the sources, but what you're looking at, the first source, is again from the beginning of Drishat Zion from Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer. This book was published in 1862. So he begins by quoting from Maseches Derech Eretz, not a widely studied book, but a book that is believed to be written during the times of the Tanaim, Maseches Derech Eretz, and he quotes as follows: Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Right? This is a statement that is attributed to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael. God said to the Jewish people, Atem garamtem lahachriv beisi. You caused my home to be destroyed. Ulihigalos es banai. And you caused me to exile my children. Essentially, the Jewish people are responsible for the destruction and for the exile of the Jewish people from the homeland. Hayu sho'alim bishloma. But if you are, well, how would you define those words? Sho'alim. What does sho'al mean? Yes. To ask. By the way, what's the name of the work? Doresh. Doresh also means to seek, to ask. But if you ask regarding the welfare of Israel, of Jerusalem, va'ani mochel lachem, I will forgive you. Dichsiv, and it quotes a pasuk. This is a verse in Psalms chapter 122, verse 6, if I'm not mistaken. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim. Inquire regarding the peace of Jerusalem, Yishlayu Ohavayich. And those who loved it will find tranquility, like Shalva. So Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher sees from this passage, from Maseches Derech Eretz, really the seeds of religious Zionism. Because what defines Zionism in general, but religious Zionism specifically, is the thought that we are to be sho'el. We are to be doresh. We have to take active steps in bringing forth the Messianic era. And again, this will stand in stark contrast to another strain of thought that was put forth most staunchly by the Satmar Rav Yoel Teitelbaum. We'll have to discuss a little bit what he was thinking as well. But what stands really as the marker, as the flag for Zionism and religious Zionism, and I can differentiate between the two in just a moment, is the belief that we are mandated to take the first steps to bringing about redemption. And the difference between Zionism and religious Zionism, and there are many things to say about this, but from the perspective of just this statement from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, is that Zionism believes, and Rabbi Reiner really spoke so beautifully about it last week, that it's in the best interest of the Jewish people to seek out a homeland, to take active steps to bringing about the creation of a state. Religious Zionism believes it's a religious imperative. That God is telling us over here, Hayu sho'alim bishloma, inquire about the state of Jerusalem. That's not something that we do because it has utilitarian benefits. It's something that's very helpful to us. We do so because it's a religious imperative to take active steps towards our redemption. So he goes on. Now this is the writing of Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher himself. Yirtzeh, and he writes somewhat poetically, and I'm not going to translate word for word, but I'm going to certainly give you the gist of what the words mean over here. And he writes over here very beautifully. Yirtzeh, im b'chol leiv tishalu v'tivakshu shalom Yerushalayim. If we desire with our whole heart to seek out Jerusalem, and of course Jerusalem is just symbolic of the Jewish state, as only after we seek out the Jewish state, Yishlayu Ohavayich, where there will be peace and tranquility for all those who love Zion. Ve'omer Yishalom b'cheilech shalva b'armanosayich. I apologize. Am I mistranslating the word Yishlayu Ohavayich? I don't think so, but if someone wants to offer an alternative translation, I'm certainly up for it. I should have, I apologize. I was looking at it this morning, and then I meant to write it down. Let me just check right now. All I have to do is Google Psalms 122, and I got it. Okay, so let's just make sure we're translating correctly. While it brings up, of course, my internet is running slowly right now because that would, of course, make sense given the circumstances. So let's move on. But when we have an exact translation, I'll come back to it. But, okay. Here we go. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. So Yishlayu means secure, tranquility. It's probably related to the same shoresh. So I was right, Baruch Hashem. Okay, so V'omer Yisholom b'cheilech, let there be peace and tranquility in your cities. Shalva ba'amnosayich. Right, which he explains to me as follows: Im yeh einecha v'libcha el admas kodesh. If your heart and your eyes, really eyes comes first, if your eyes and your heart are on the holy land, az yivaka kashachar orecha, then the light will have space to come in through the slits, lichaper avon, v'harek shefa tal habracha, v'chayim ad holam. Basically, if we are constantly focused on the land of Israel, so then there will be place for the God's shefa, God's abundance and blessings to come and bless the earth. Uvameh yiske et orcho bekodesh lihiyot or lo b'tzion. Through what will we merit having this beautiful light shine on Zion? Al zeh ne'emar, regarding this, he quotes a Torah verse, Bepicha uvalvcha la'asoso. Right, this is really a quote regarding what Moses said, that the Torah is in our mouth and our hearts, and we're capable of fulfilling all that's written in the Torah. But he is expounding upon it, midrash it, I would say, with a little bit of poetic license. Beficha, it's in your mouth. Lihispalel abinyana umichonosa, to daven for the building and the establishment of the state. Bilvalvcha, what does it mean to be in your heart? Shelo yisach michoshin libcha kosef rivcha al har Tzion. You should not stop thinking about Zion. V'lo yachashu hamaskirim et Hashem b'cholev yidrashu. We have to seek out God with all of His heart, with all of our hearts. And look at the last statement over here. Las so. It's in our ability to do b'chol nafshecha, with all of our soul, b'foel, literally with our actions, ub'chol me'odecha b'mamoncha, with our money, lahazil zahav mikiso, v'ish ish beberchas Hashem aleinu, yoshia le'inav eretz Yisrael. Everybody, according to their wealth, has to support the establishment of the land of Israel. Ki ha'am hayoshev ba nose'ei avon, because the land that we are, ki ha'am hayoshev ba, the people that live on the land right now are nosei avon, are sinners. Oskim, they are nosei avon. They are carrying. They're carrying the burden, correct. Oskim b'Torah Hashem yomam v'layla. They are constantly engaged in Torah study. Vishalu lechem oy. They're like looking for bread. So he goes on basically to say that it's our responsibility to support the efforts that are currently taking place in the land of Israel. And then he goes on to say that we know that according to the Jewish law, you're supposed to support those people who live in your city before the people who live in the land of Israel. And he writes to that point that that does not include the land of Israel, essentially. Let me read it to you inside, in the third paragraph. Merabim omrim. Many people say, "Dai lanu lechalkel aniyei irenu." We have to support the people of our cities. Ki kvar amarnu aniyei irecha kodmin. We have a principle that the poor people of our cities take precedent. Va'amnam yirei shamayim yatzeh kulam. But a God-fearing person will fulfill it all, meaning to support the local needy, and they will also support those who live in the land of Israel. V'asher yikpotz yadom nidvat hakodesh v'hamikdash mimakom kodesh yihalechu. And he speaks in like this very flowery language about the people who are able ultimately to support people who live both in the local area and in the land of Israel. So in Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher's mind, sending money to the land of Israel was an active way of building up the land. But the kernel that I'm trying to share with you, again, what you see from just the opening 2 or 3 paragraphs of his work, is that he believed in an active engagement in bringing about the state of Israel and in ultimately supporting all of those efforts that are taking place in the Holy Land. And that was really, that this planted the seeds in terms of the religious Zionism philosophy that took hold over the coming decades and ultimately over the coming centuries. There's much more to be said about Rav Tzvi Kalisher, but I'm just giving you like a couple of kernels of thought, and with God's help we'll be able to flesh them out over the coming weeks, months, and years as well. So another major proponent of religious Zionism, and you really can't speak about Zionism without talking about Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, who lived from 1865 to 1935. He's considered the father of religious Zionism. And he was able to, really, he picked up from where Kalisher they overlapped, but he picked up in terms of gaining steam in religious Zionism thought and trying to encourage more people to buy into this concept of building the land of Israel. Rabbi Kook himself published an essay about Zionism while he was serving as a rabbi in Boisk, Lithuania. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. If anyone knows a better pronunciation, I'm happy to hear it. It's spelled B-O-I-S-K, Boisk, Lithuania. And in his essay, he argued that modern Jewish nationalism, even in the most secular of ways, expresses the divinity within which the Jewish soul within the Jewish soul and signifies the beginning of the Messianic age. Rabbi Kook himself moves to Palestine in 1904 and served as the rabbi of YIFL and the agricultural settlements nearby. In 1999, Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook becomes the chief rabbi of the Ashkenazic Jews in Jerusalem. And in 1921, he becomes the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Palestine in the period of the British Mandate. As chief rabbi, Rav Kook worked to spread his religious Zionist ideals. He founded a Zionist yeshiva, Merkaz Harav, which is still very much alive today, Baruch Hashem, and defended the secular Zionists in the face of widespread religious opposition. Rav Kook was an Ohev Yisrael, really uniquely so. He was someone who loved all segments of the population, and he was attacked because Zionism really took hold in the secular world much more than it did in the religious world. And to be a proponent of building the state of Israel essentially meant working with people who were even called, it's hard to say, Rishayim, Mamish, people who were evildoers, who were not just pariv about their religious observance, they were anti their religious observance. So joining with the religious movement, aligning yourself with the Zionist movement was actually extremely difficult for a Jew, because it meant that you were going to work with people who were anti-religious, not just pariv, anti-religious. And Rav Kook believed that in spite of all of that, it's still a worthwhile endeavor, and that ultimately, Zionism is a holy spark from God, and everybody who's attached to the land of Israel in one way or another will benefit. So I just want to share with you a couple of excerpts from Rav Kook's writings as well that speak about this point, about the holiness of the mission of Zionism in general, and about working with the anti-religious in the establishment of a state. Rav Kook died again in 1935. He did not merit to see the actual establishment, but he was a big proponent of working alongside the Zionists to bring about the fulfillment of the Zionist dream. So if you look with me over here it's the second bolded and underlined part of the first side of the sheet, and here are just a couple of excerpts that really give you a sense of what Rav Kook believed regarding Zionism and working with the secularists to bring about the Zionist ideal. He writes over here, "There is no need to check the level of kashrut of those who come, for the land will vomit out the true chaff." Okay, that's not such a positive thing to say necessarily, but he's saying what he's saying is let God do God's work, and you just work with the people who are on the right team. That's essentially what he's saying. If people have if people are doing the right thing, the religious observance shouldn't be a point of focus, because that God will take care of that. "And all those remaining shall be called holy. This is similar to how we do not separate food from its waste elements before we eat it, but leave this separation process to life's natural functions." It's an interesting idea, right? Just like our body processes all of the nutrients and takes it and gives it to whichever part of the body that we need, and the refuse comes out the other side. So we can let Hashem do just like it's in our body. Hashem's doing that work on a grander scale. We can work with the secularists and let God do the rest of the work. Okay, second paragraph. "The merit of the land even protects the wicked. Even a Gentile maidservant in the land of Israel is promised a portion in the world to come. Clearly, the Talmud is not speaking of a righteous maidservant who would anyway merit the world to come. Rather, it is referring to an ordinary maidservant with sordid deeds and coarse traits. Nonetheless, the merit of living in the land of Israel enables her to gain a portion of the world to come. So anybody that's connected to Eretz Yisrael, to Medinat Yisrael, will have a spiritual elevation. And the Rav Kook believed that, and interestingly, Rav Kook is saying that applies to everybody, even the non-Jews have such a blessing coming to them. All the more so, he's speaking here regarding the secular Zionists, since one may find in every Jew, even the most unworthy, precious gems of good deeds and positive traits. We need more Gedolei Yisrael speaking that way. We need more leaders of Israel speaking about everybody these days. Certainly, the land of Israel helps elevate and sanctify them. And if this is not evident in them, it will become so in their descendants. It was the lofty righteous of previous generations who ignited a holy inner fire, a burning love for the holiness of Eretz Yisrael in the hearts of God's people. He's referring to Herzl and others, the secularist Zionists who were able to ignite the passion for a yearning for Zion. Due to their efforts, individuals gathered in the desolated land until significant areas became a Garden of Eden, and a large and important community of entire people of Israel has settled in our holy land. So we have a lot to be thankful for in terms of the secularists and the Zionists. Recently, however, the pious and great scholars have gradually abandoned the enterprise of settling the Holy Land. This holy work has been appropriated by those lacking in Torah knowledge and good deeds. Nonetheless, we seek the secularist dedication in deed and action, and nourished from initial efforts of true tzaddikim who kindled the holy desire to rebuild the Holy Land and return our exiles there. Okay, so basically, what I wanted to share with you from Rav Kook, the kernel from Rav Kook, is the second important idea, that even though the land of Israel and Zionism in general, and the land of Israel more specifically, was built through people who are anti-religious, it does not stop us from aligning ourselves with their beliefs. Obviously, we're not aligning ourselves with their secularist beliefs, but with the Zionist dream, we very much are able to join with them, at least according to the Hashkafa, the outlook of Rav Kook. We're able to join with them and share with them in realizing the dream of the Zionists. And this point has been debated back and forth in the religious camp, whether or not it's appropriate to join or we need to stand aside from those who are not religious. It's very interesting. Some people have made the observation that there are other places in Jewish history when the redemption has been brought about through those who are not religious. Those of you who are familiar with the story, it's a Haftorah, I forget for which, maybe it's Parshas Mitzorah. I believe it's Parshas Mitzorah, regarding the 4 lepers. There's a story recorded in Kings 2 regarding 4 lepers. So if you have leprosy, you're not the most upstanding of Jewish people. Okay, but you're still a Jew. And the story goes that there were 4 lepers who were banished from the camp because that was part of the punishment of leprosy. Leprosy is not really the correct word, saras, but we'll use the word lepers for now. And they were banished from the camp, and they were sent out to be they were excommunicated, and they basically saw that they had 2 options. They had either an option of going back inside the camp and risking being sent out again and being ostracized, or they could throw themselves at the hands of the Assyrians, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was Ashur. They could throw they can throw themselves at the hands of the Assyrians, they were threatening to attack the Jewish camp. So they decided, listen, either way, it's not a good situation. So they decided to go to the camp of Ashur, throw themselves at the hands of the Assyrians, and at least they'll be taken and fed and so on and so forth. And what happens is, the Navi tells us, they go and get ready to throw themselves at the hands of their soon-to-be captors, and nobody's there. And God has made a tremendous miracle, and the camp of the Assyrians had run away. So the Daled Mitzorim, these 4 people with a leprosy, if you will, have the zechus, have the merit of going back to the Jewish people and telling them that our enemies have scattered. Essentially, they brought about a Yeshua. They brought about the redemption. So some religious Zionist thinkers who have followed in the path of Rav Kook pointed out that just like we saw in Malachim Beis, in Kings chapter, in Kings 2, that the salvation was brought about through these lepers. They're the ones that brought the good news that the Jewish people are saved. So too, that was really a roadmap for Jewish history, that our salvation will come at the hands of those people who are not religious, and does not mean that we should scorn them and walk away from them. It means we are to embrace them and to be thankful for all of their efforts. And that really is another hallmark of religious Zionism, is not walking away from the secular efforts, but embracing the secular efforts. And ultimately, if you're a member of Israeli society today, even in the most Haredi circles, putting aside Neturei Karta, which we'll talk about, but if you take money from the government, so ultimately you are agreeing on some level to this concept of working alongside the secular Zionists to build the state and maintain the state. So that's the second point that I wanted to share with you today. Again, we saw from Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher the concept that religious Zionism, the philosophy of religious Zionism, is taking active steps towards bringing about our redemption. The kernel that I wanted to share with you from Rav Kook was the concept that we work alongside the secular Zionists, and there's much to be gained from their perspective and from our perspective of the teamwork and the partnership that was necessary. And the third kernel that I want to share with you today is from Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik, really I would say his magnum opus on religious Zionism. It's hard to say what would be Rabbi Soloveitchik's magnum opus. He wrote so many magnificent works. Perhaps, I don't even conjecture. But his magnum opus on religious Zionism was Kol Dodi Fake. We actually mentioned on Shabbos, and I had I guess the good fortune that not so many of you were there, so I can repeat myself and it'll be new information. But we talked about on Shabbos, and Shabbos afternoon, Rabbi Schachter points out that Rabbi Soloveitchik was a real loyalist to family traditions, but that did not stop him from adapting to the times. It doesn't mean he left behind his family's traditions. That's not the case at all. But Rabbi Soloveitchik was a man with a magnificent mind, to say the least, and he understood that sometimes situations evolve, the world evolves, where different positions are necessary. So even though Soloveitchik's in general, his grandfather, Chaim Soloveitchik, was a staunch anti-Zionist, but again, what that really meant was that he disassociated himself from the secular Zionist movement. It wasn't Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik does not write like the Rav Yoel Teitelbaum writes. So it's a very different anti-Zionist feeling than the Neturei Karta. But either way, the Soloveitchik family was generally an anti-Zionist family because of its secular nature. And Rabbi Soloveitchik really felt that where he was in his life and the development of the state of Israel, that a new position was necessary. So he famously joined the Mizrahi movement, which was a religious Zionist movement. And in 1956, Rabbi Soloveitchik gave a lecture at Yeshiva University that ultimately became a printed book called Kol Dodi Fake, My Beloved is Calling on Me, where Rabbi Soloveitchik goes through different, basically talks about the 6 knocks that we read about in Shir HaShirim, and how each knock is a knock from God, sending us a message that the time of deliverance is both here and near. We're not at the time of ultimate deliverance, but the time where God is going to be walking us closer to deliverance, to the times of Mashiach, is definitely here. And we are really mandated by a religious imperative to respond and join the cause, really join the cause. So I wanted to share with you, this is just a condensed form of what he writes, but you do have his actual language over here. So let's look carefully at the 6 knocks that Rabbi Soloveitchik describes, again, based on the allegorical story that's recorded in Shir HaShirim. So Rabbi Soloveitchik in 1956 writes as follows. First, the knock of opportunity was heard in the political arena. No one can deny that from the standpoint of international relations, the establishment of the State of Israel, in a political sense, was an almost supernatural occurrence. Right? The fact that Rabbi Soloveitchik calls it an unholy alliance between the West and the Soviet Union, it was the Cold War, it was the beginning of the Cold War essentially, that nonetheless they were able to come together through the United Nations to vote on the UN resolution for Palestine and to create the state of Israel was something that was nothing less than miraculous. The Rav writes, and unfortunately what he wrote in 1956 hasn't really changed, that he believes that the entire purpose of creating the United Nations was only for that one vote, for essentially the partition plan. That was the entire purpose of the creation of the United Nations, because no good has come from the United Nations since then. So that was the Rav writing in 1956, and he was prescient in his remarks because no good has come since then from the United Nations. But Rabbi Soloveitchik understood that the way what played out on the world stage in the political arena was no Jew can just say, well, it just happened to be that the Soviet Union, the US, and the Allies just came together and everyone's opinions coalesced to form the state of it. It just can't be. It's beyond reason. And we would be religiously ignorant to ignore the knock on the door that God sent us through the vote over the partition plan, the state of Israel, and we need to hear God knocking through what took place on November 29th, 1947. Again, that was the partition plan. Second, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, the knocking of the beloved could be heard on the battlefield. The small Israeli defense forces defeated the mighty armies of the Arab countries. The miracle of the many in the hands of the few, right? That's a reference to what we talk about on Hanukkah. Rab and Ma'ad Ma'atim took place before our very eyes. Rabbi Soloveitchik actually used the analogy of Yetzias Mitzrayim in a way to explain this, because we know that when Moshe goes to the Jewish people at first, so Moshe says, I'm here on behalf of God. We want to take a 3-day vacation. That's it, a 3-day vacation. The Mefarshei Torah, perhaps we'll have opportunities to discuss this in just a few weeks, talk about the fact that Moshe, was he lying? Was he not lying? Was there any intention just to leave for 3 days? So there's much to be said about that. But ultimately, Paro says, I'm not interested. And in the end, Paro loses everything. He could have had the people stay, theoretically, and there was just going to be a 3-day journey. It would have been like a Gilligan's Island 3-day journey, but it would have been a 3-day journey. And Paro flat out dismissed it and said, no, who is God? I'm going to listen to him. So Rabbi Soloveitchik said that if the Arabs would have accepted the partition plan, we would have received a lot less territory than we were able to conquer militarily. So the fact that the Arabs patently did not accept anything that the United Nations voted on, so that was actually a miracle in disguise. It forced us into war, but it ultimately allowed us to have significant gains militarily in ways that we would not have received politically. So that was the second knock, the victory. He's only speaking in 1956. 67 hadn't taken place yet. Yom Kippur War, which obviously is much more weighty than the 67 War, but certainly the 6-Day War was even greater display of this knock. So the Rav writes, to ignore what happened, our victory in Milchemet HaShichrur in 1948, would be religiously ignorant. It would be closing our ears and our eyes to what the messages God are sending us through the miracles on the battlefield. Number 3. Third, the beloved began to knock as well on the door on the theological tent. And it may very well be that this is the strongest knock of all. All the claims of Christian theologians that God deprived the Jewish people of its rights in the land of Israel, and that all the biblical promises regarding Zion and Jerusalem refer in the allegorical sense to Christianity and the Christian church, have been publicly refuted by the establishment of the state of Israel and have been exposed as falsehoods lacking all validity. Right? Because much of Christian dogma is based on the fact that we are the rejected child, that God came to Israel and then He chose to forge a new covenant through Jesus, and that's what Christianity is all about. The Old Testament is basically the Christian way of saying it's an old covenant. The Jewish people are out, and the fact that the Jews have always been the downtrodden and those who have suffered has always been, there's Christian doctrine about that our suffering had traditionally always been a proof, a raya, that Christianity is correct. because it's God's way of demonstrating that we have done wrong by not accepting Jesus and they have done right, which is why they are successful. And when the state of Israel was established, so that entire doctrine, that entire theology went out the door. The Rav talks about how much pride he has when he sees the nation of Israel referenced in the papers, because the state of Israel referenced in the papers, because it is really a rejection of so much of what Christianity is founded upon. Ultimately, the Christians had to re-articulate some of their positions after the founding of the state of Israel, but that's for another lecture. So that was the third knock. The fourth knock, the beloved is knocking in the hearts of the perplexed and assimilated youths. The era of self-concealment at the Hester Panim at the beginning of 1940s resulted in great confusion amongst the Jewish masses, and in particular among the Jewish youth. Buried, hidden thoughts and paradoxical reflections emerged from the depths of the souls of even the most avid assimilationists. Avowed assimilationists, thank you. And once a Jew begins to think and contemplate, once his sleep is disturbed, who knows where his thoughts will take him, what form of expression and doubts and queries will assume. So basically, there was a reawakening of the Jewish spirit, of the Jewish soul with Hakamat HaMedina. That only increased multifold after the 67 war, right? That many people attribute the Baal Tshuva movement to the 67 war and the concept of Jewish pride that resulted from that. And the Rav was a big believer that the swelling of Jewish pride that was taking place because of the land of Israel was another knock from God. Number 5, the fifth knock of the beloved is perhaps the most important of all. For the first time in the history of our exile, divine providence has surprised our enemies with the sensational discovery that Jewish blood is not free for the taking, is not hefker, is not ownerless. And the Rav was again a big believer in the moral responsibility of the Jewish nation to defend itself. You know, the Rav pointed out that in halacha we don't say an eye for an eye. We don't believe in exacting revenge in the same way as it was a victim suffers something, so it's not upon the victim. It's not correct for the victim to take revenge, and we could talk about that for a long time, but not right now. But the Rav said publicly that he did not believe that we should abandon an eye for an eye theology when it comes to those of our aggressors, and he believed that it is our right to defend ourselves. I'll read you a quote that I did not put on the paper. With regard to Nasser and the Mufti, I would demand that we interpret the phrase in a strictly literal sense, as referring to the removal of the concrete actual eye. Revenge is forbidden when it serves no purpose. However, if by taking revenge we raise ourselves up to the plane of self-defense, then it becomes the elementary right of man qua man to avenge the wrong afflicted upon him. So the ability to stand up for ourselves, defend ourselves, to show the world that Jewish blood is not cheap, is a powerful, is certainly just a powerful idea. And the ability to express ours, to defend ourselves, was another knock from the Almighty. And lastly, the sixth knock, which we must not ignore, was heard when the gates of the land were opened. A Jew who flees from a hostile country now knows that he can find a secure refuge in the land of his ancestors. Now that the era of divine self-concealment is over, Jews who have been uprooted from their homes can find lodging in the Holy Land. So 6 knocks that we read about in Shir HaShirim are ultimately 6 knocks of the divine, letting us know that Zionism is a religious ideal that God is communicating to us through the stage of history. And we are literally religiously ignorant and deaf-mute if we don't see the hand of God playing out in history. So that was the third kernel that I wanted to share with you today. Again, I just hope I'm whetting your appetite, because all of these pieces require a great amount of study on their own. But I want to finish off with something which is perhaps the hardest to speak about. And that is the other perspective in terms of religious Zionism, which I would say is the anti-religious Zionism camp. You would hope that everything in Jewish law, all hashkafos, so all perspectives and philosophies, are rooted in texts, because Jews can pontificate. They've been known to do so, actually. Can pontificate from today to tomorrow. but unless a theology is rooted in the text, it's worthless. So even those of even the Jews from among us who take an opposite approach, they have to validate their approach somehow in the text of our sages, and they do. And we could spend, again, hours and days dissecting, but I just wanted to give you a little taste, a little kernel of the fourth perspective, which is really one that we don't espouse. But that's why I call this lecture One Land, Many Perspectives, because there are many perspectives regarding the land of Israel, Medinat Yisrael. So if you look on the last page, the Gemara in Ksubos also speaks of verses in Shir HaShirim. And the verses in Shir HaShirim speak about 3 different times where we are told, we take an oath. Hishpati etchem. Hishpati etchem benos Yerushalayim. Right? So God makes us take an oath. He makes the daughters of Zion, the daughters of Jerusalem, take an oath. And the 3 oaths are interpreted to reference 3 different actions, if you will, or policies that the Jewish people are not allowed to do over the course of time. And this Gemara serves as the basis for the perspective of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum in his Vayoel Moshe, a pretty well-known work that serves as the basis for anti-Zionists and unfortunately for the Neturei Karta as well. Neturei Karta are Satmar Hasidim, and they are taking this approach. So it doesn't. I'm in no way excusing their behavior. I think I'm happy to even say publicly, I think it's a horrific chil Hashem that they'll have to give a din cheshbon and shemayim for. I don't know what else to say. But it doesn't stop us from understanding, at least on some level, beyond a Meshuggah element, what's motivating them. So what is motivating them? So if you look at this is a difficult passage. I mean, we can translate the words, but to really understand it requires a tremendous amount of study. But as I said, we're doing what we can for today. So the Gemara Maseches Ksubos reads as follows: Gimos Shvuos Halalu Lama. Why have we taken 3 oaths that are referenced in Shir HaShirim? Achas, the first oath, Shelo Ya'alu Yisrael B'choma, that we will literally not rise over the wall. What does that mean? So if you look in Rashi and the next source, Shelo Ya'alu B'choma, Yachad, so first of all, we won't go together. Yachad means together. So any mass aliyah movement is not allowed. Biyad chazakah, with a heavy hand, with force. Exactly. That we're not allowed to enter the walls of Jerusalem, which again is not just Jerusalem, it means all of Israel. We're not allowed to enter Israel together en masse with force. That was an oath that we took to God. So that's number 1. Number 2, second line. V'achas sheishpia kadosh baruch hu es ovdei kochavim. No, I'm sorry, I'm skipping. Back to the first line. V'achas sheishpia kadosh baruch hu es Yisrael shelo yimradu b'umos olam. That we will not rebel against the nations of the world. Meaning that we'll be gracious visitors. As long as we're in the exile and we're in a host country, we have to be kind to our hosts, and we're not allowed to go ahead and rebel. V'achas sheishpia kadosh baruch hu es ovdei kochavim shelo yishtabdu bahem v'Yisrael yosem midai. God made the nations of the world take the third oath that they're not going to subjugate us too much. Yoser midai, too much. So we have 3 oaths. I apologize. I said God made the daughters of Zion take 3 oaths. He made the daughters of Zion take 2 oaths and made the nations of the world take 1 oath. So again, what are the 3 oaths? That we will not Shelo Ya'alu B'choma. We're not going to overtake the walls with strength. And number 2 is that we're going to be kind visitors. We're not going to cause our hosts any problems. And number 3, that the non-Jewish hosts are going to be kind to us. And, well, I shouldn't say kind. They're not going to subjugate us too much. So the Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, Vayoel Moshe sees in this passage of the Gemara in Ksubos basically a basis for taking an extremely passive stance in Jewish destiny, certainly as it relates to the land of Israel. The Rav Yoel Teitelbaum believes that anything that we do to take an active stance in bringing about our redemption and forming the land of Israel is patently prohibited. based on this Gemara. Shelo Ya'alu B'choma, we're not allowed to try to conquer the walls. And this really stands in direct opposition to what we started with in Drishat Zion from Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher. Rav Kalisher said, God is begging, inquire about my welfare, send money to support those who are already there. And he laid the foundation of work for he bred the concept of active Zionism, bringing about the redemption. And Rav Yoel Teitelbaum believed that the opposite is true, and any step we take further is a violation of this oath. And by the way, you should just know that this has practical ramifications. We can't necessarily just dismiss this passage in the Gemara. There's a well-known omission that is focused on by many. The Rambam, Maimonides, who codifies Jewish law, he also counts all the mitzvot. He is the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvos, counts 613 mitzvot. Count 613 mitzvot. On that subject, I'm just going to tell you a cute story I heard. I was listening to a lecture, and there was somebody, I forget who, from the land of Israel, a major religious Zionist who came to collect money. I forget his name. And he was good friends with Rav Ruderman in Baltimore, the late Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael. So when he came to Baltimore, he stayed by Rav Ruderman. And the Zionists in the area, there were many secular Zionists in Baltimore, were very upset at this religious Zionist for staying with Rav Ruderman, because after all, Rav Ruderman did not espouse the same theological, religious Zionist perspectives. So they were giving him a bit of a hard time. I apologize for forgetting his name. Giving him a hard time. So he turned to them and he said, listen, I have to be frank. You and I, we agree on one point regarding the importance of the state of Israel and building up Medinat Yisrael. But that's pretty much all we agree on. With Rav Ruderman, 612 things we agree on. One we don't. I'd rather stay with him. Okay, I'm not sure if that's true or not true. It's a cute story. The bottom line is, the Rambam does not codify living in the land of Israel. Glaringly absent from the pages of his Sefer Mitzvos, when he counts the 613 mitzvos, living in the land of Israel, making aliyah, is not there. So does that mean the Rambam believes there's no mitzvah to make aliyah? So again, we could discuss this for weeks. But I just want to share with you one perspective. The Megillat Esther, not the book that we read on Purim, but actually one of the commentaries on the Rambam, Sefer Mitzvos, writes as follows. This is the next source. Nirali kimashalo mina'ah harav. The reason the Rambam did not count living in the land of Israel, Lefisha mitzvah Yerushas haaretz v'shivasa, the mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel, to settle the land of Israel, lo nohaga rak b'mei Moshe v'Yeshua v'David. It was only incumbent upon the people in the times of Moses, Joshua, and David. V'chozman shelo galu me'artzam, and as long as we were not exiled, as long as we were still in the land of Israel, we had an obligation to make sure that we are safe and secure. Aval achar shegalu me'alad masam. After we are exiled, a mitzvah zuno heges ladoros. It's not a mitzvah that's relevant for all generations. And Maimonides only counted mitzvot in his 613, which were relevant for all generations. The Torah tells us in Parsha B'Shalach that Jews are commanded to collect the man. So we're allowed to collect, that's a mitzvah? I mean, I guess if a son goes back to his dad and asks for money, maybe that's collecting the man. But in general, we're not commanded to go and collect the man. It doesn't fall from, we have to go out and work. So it's not a mitzvah. It was a mitzvah for that time period, not for all generations. So the Megillah Esther is suggesting that the concept of conquering the land of Israel was not a mitzvah for all generations, just in the times of Moses and Joshua. Ki adrabah, but look what the Megillah Esther writes. Just the contrary. Nitztavinu lefi Masha Amarnu B'Sof Ksubos. We're commanded based on what we have discussed in Ksubos. Shelo Nimrod B'Umos Lalechas Lichvosh Hasaretz B'Chazaka. We're not allowed to rebel and conquer the land with strength. V'Ochichu Mipasok Kishpat Yitchem B'Nos Yerushalayim. And the verse that supports this is that oath that we took in the Song of Songs. So don't dismiss this passage as being purely agadic, as being just relegated to the part of Talmud which has not halachic ramifications at all. It's not true. It could possibly explain Maimonides' position why we don't have an obligation to move to the land of Israel. Okay, again, much more to be said. But
didn't the Rambam include other mitzvahs?
Didn't the Rambam? Yeah, so there's a lot to be said. A lot to be said. But putting all of, as strong as this passage is in the Gemara, and as strong as in the Megillas Esther is, I mean, one could raise a very, very valid refutation to dismiss all of the power of this Gemara. Why? Because again, let's think about it. What was the oath? Shelo yimridu b'umos ha'olam. We won't rebel against. No, I'm sorry. Let's go back to the first oath. That's what I was focusing on. Shelo yalu Yisrael b'choma. That we will not rise on the walls and conquer the wall aggressively against the will of the nations of the world. Right? Rashi says Yachab Yad Chazaka. We won't go with force. Okay, so that might have been very theologically sound until 1948. You could even say before that, maybe already in the Balfour Declaration, right? Maybe by that point already, when the government of the land of England, what is it? Looked I forget the actual language. Looks positively upon the population of the land of Israel. I forget the exact language. But once the non-Jews intimated to us that they'd be open to our cultivating and populating, ultimately taking hold of the land of Israel, and certainly in 1948 after the UN partition plan, so 1947 was the partition plan, but in 48 after we declared our independence, so does this Gemara even apply anymore? Does this Gemara even apply? The Shvuah was Shelo Ya'alu Yisrael Bechoma, that we are not allowed to take over the land biyad chazakah, as Rashi says, with force. But once they give it to us, once they even intimate it to us, that they be open to our taking hold of the land, and they ultimately gave it to us, could you say that this oath still applies? And not only, there's so many ways to deflect the passage of this Gemara. Well, it's a package deal. So look at that third oath. What was the third oath? It was the non-Jews. Shelo yishtabdu b'hen b'Yisrael yoser midai. That the non-Jews can't be too harsh on us. It's one of the, everyone's connected. If you break one oath, they're all broken. So what is the marker for too much? I don't know, but I can tell you definitively that obviously the Shoah was too much. So if they're not keeping up their end of the deal, why do we have to keep up our end of the deal? I mean, we could go on and dissect this Gemara. Ultimately, this Gemara really is agadic. I mean, that's the bottom line. You see that in the Pnei Yeshua and many others, that to create an entire theology based on these three lines from the Gemara Ksubos is a real stretch. I mean, it's easy for me to say, but you have an entire sect of Orthodox Jews who essentially have taken a very strong line approach based on these lines of the Gemara. Even today. But it's not the general approach. But there are those, if you look in the last source, Yoel Moshe of Teitelbaum, he speaks about this point. Just if you look at the underlined section over here, and I thank Rabbi David Gottlieb for bringing this source to my attention. He writes, V'im kol shara umos shebechol ha'olam Yomru liYisroel limrod ba'uma sheyoshim b'neihem. So let's say everybody, all the nations of the world decided that the Jews in Russia should go ahead and rebel against the Jews, against the Russian government. I mean, everyone gave us permission all we want, but if we don't have permission from the Russian government to rebel, this is no permission. So Rabbi Teitelbaum suggested that the United Nations can say all they want, but unless the indigenous people, I guess the Arabs who were living at the time, unless they would go ahead and give us permission, so we would still be rebelling. The partition plan essentially does not carry much weight in the mind of Rabbi Teitelbaum. Again, it's very, very troubling. Don't want to waste my breath on it. It's so troubling, but it's something you should be familiar with. The truth is that the Brits had the power over it. Was the British mandate, so they were the Balabatim, and they were the ones that gave us permission. But anyways, I wanted just at least to share with you a little bit of what they're thinking. So I hope you found today's class meaningful and not just superficial, because it on some level was superficial. And I apologize again for really biting off more than I could chew in one or two classes, and it spurred even more interest for me on this topic, and perhaps we'll have other opportunities to get together. We can do another series in a month or so, another history series. Rabbi Browner, you won't be here. Maybe you can teleconference in. but you'll send us some warmth as well. Although the rate we're going, it's not so bad. But the bottom line is just to review for just a moment or two. We started with the piece from Drishat Zion from Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, who told us about the importance of being active players in bringing about the redemption, right? We have to first be sha'alu b'shloma v'ani mochalehem. You have to first inquire about the welfare of Israel, and then the redemption can come. And he talks about the importance of supporting those who are living in the land of Israel, and that set the stage for a much more active type of religious Zionism that we see flourish later on. We saw the perspective of Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, that even though much of the Zionist movement was a secular movement and they were anti-religious, it should not stop us from our involvement with partnering with them, because ultimately everybody benefits when you're working for the land of Israel. And what motivates them at their core is something very, very positive. And he points out that the holy inner fire of Zionism was lit by those who were secularists. So to ignore it would be making a very significant mistake. We looked very quickly at the 6 knocks that Rabbi Soloveitchik saw. And the six knocks from Shir Hashirim that represent the six knocks that God has been knocking on our door, waking us up in the modern era regarding the importance of the state of Israel and how critical it is to believe that we are entering a messianic times, because God is making such strong overtures to us. And lastly, we finished off by looking at the last perspective, the other perspective, that we're not allowed to be active players in bringing about the state of Israel and in fulfilling our Zionist dreams. But we've shared with you just a little bit why that does not seem to resonate so strongly with us. And with Hashem's help, we'll continue to delve into some of these topics in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much.
You do good.